Charlotte Delbo, the Auschwitz survivor who secretly documented the horror, January 27th, 1943, dawn. Auschwitz-Birkenau, occupied Poland. The heavy wooden doors of the cattle car slide open with a violent crash, letting in a blinding rush of freezing air. Charlotte Delbo steps out onto the snow-covered railway ramp. She is 29 years old. Beside her are 229 other French women. They have been traveling for 3 days without food, without water, and without knowing their final destination. The stench of human waste and sheer terror is overpowering. SS guards scream in German, swinging heavy wooden truncheons. Their German shepherds strain at their leather leashes, barking furiously at the disoriented prisoners. The women are exhausted, terrified, and freezing in the sub-zero Polish winter. They are political prisoners, part of a group that will become infamous as Convoy 31,000. The guards expect them to cower. They expect them to stumble silently and obediently into the machinery of the camp. But Charlotte looks at the women around her. They make a silent, collective, and incredibly dangerous decision. They lock arms. They raise their heads. And as they are marched through the iron gates under the mocking sign, Arbeit macht frei, 230 women begin to sing. They sing La Marseillaise, the French national anthem. The sound of their defiance cuts through the freezing fog and echoes against the electrified barbed wire. The SS guards freeze in shock. Other prisoners stare in disbelief. It is a moment of pure, staggering courage. But Charlotte knows the song will not save them. She knows that most of the women holding her arms tightly will be dead in a matter of weeks. As she crosses the threshold into the most notorious death camp in human history, she makes a silent, ironclad vow. If she survives, she will remember every single one of their names. She will become their witness. Charlotte Delbo was not born into a life of political extremism, nor was she raised to be a soldier. She was born on August 10th, 1913, in Vigny-sur-Seine, a working-class suburb of Paris. Her father was a riveter. She grew up surrounded by the hum of machinery and the quiet, daily struggles of everyday people. But Charlotte possessed a brilliant, observant mind and a fierce passion for literature. She studied shorthand and typing, practical skills that unexpectedly opened a door to the vibrant world of art. In 1937, she secured a position as the assistant to Louis Jouvet, one of the most famous and chaotic theater directors in France. She transcribed his notes, organized his rehearsals, and immersed herself in the magic of the stage. She learned how words could shape reality. She learned how to memorize vast amounts of dialogue and observe the deepest corners of the human condition. She also fell deeply in love. She married Georges Dudac, a passionate intellectual journalist. Their life was filled with poetry, debate, and the electric energy of 1930s Paris. Then, the German war machine crossed the border. In May 1940, France fell in a matter of weeks. When the occupation began, Charlotte and Louis Jouvet were far away. They were on a theatrical tour in South America, completely safe from the Gestapo and the bombing raids. Charlotte could have stayed in Buenos Aires. She could have lived a comfortable, quiet life in exile, waiting out the madness. But the news from home grew darker. Friends were being arrested. The French resistance was being systematically hunted. In the autumn of 1941, Charlotte made a decision that defied all self-preservation. She packed her bags to return to occupied Paris. She told Jouvet she could not stand being safe while others were being guillotined. She chose to walk back into the fire. Reunited with Georges, Charlotte threw herself into the clandestine world of the French resistance. They joined a communist-aligned network, working alongside brilliant intellects like the philosopher Georges Politzer. They didn't carry explosives or assassinate German officers. Their weapons were ink, paper, and truth. They published underground newspapers exposing German atrocities and urging the French populace to fight back. They listened to forbidden BBC broadcasts, transcribed the news, and distributed pamphlets under the noses of the Gestapo. It was a deadly, invisible game of cat and mouse. A single misplaced typewriter ribbon could mean execution. On the morning of March 2nd, 1942, the game ended. Collaborationist French police, working under the orders of the Gestapo, kicked down the door of their apartment. Charlotte and Georges were arrested and dragged away. They were taken to the prison of La Santé. For 2 agonizing months, they were held in isolation. On the morning of May 23rd, 1942, the guards allowed them to see each other one last time. They were given a few minutes to say goodbye. Georges had been condemned to death. Charlotte held her husband, trying to memorize the lines of his face. He told her she must be brave. He told her she had to survive. Hours later, Georges Dudac was taken to the execution grounds at Mont Valérien and shot by a German firing squad. He was 28 years old. Charlotte's heart was shattered. But the Nazis did not give her time to mourn. She was transferred to the Romainville transit camp, where she met the women who would become her sisters in hell. On January 24th, 1943, 230 women were loaded into the cattle cars. They were teachers, scientists, housewives, and students. They were the only transport of female political prisoners sent from France directly to Auschwitz. When they arrived, their heads were shaved. Their names were officially erased from the world. Charlotte was no longer a woman, a wife, or a writer. She was a number violently tattooed onto her left forearm, 31661. Auschwitz-Birkenau was not. Designed for survival. It was an industrial complex built for extermination and slave labor. The women of Convoy 31,000 were assigned to hard labor in the freezing, unforgiving Polish winter. They were forced to clear swamps, dig ditches, and carry massive bricks barehanded. The temperature regularly plummeted to minus 20 degrees Celsius. Dysentery, typhus, and starvation ravaged their ranks immediately. Every morning, during the brutal, hours-long roll calls known as appel, women would collapse in the snow. To fall meant a vicious beating from the guards. To not get up meant the gas chamber. Within the first 2 months, over half of the 230 French women were dead. It was here, in the absolute epicenter of human cruelty, that Charlotte Delbo realized her true mission. She could not physically fight the SS guards. She could not stop the smoke pouring endlessly from the crematorium chimneys. But she could fight oblivion. The Nazis wanted to erase these women from existence. They wanted their deaths to be anonymous, forgotten statistics. Charlotte refused to let them win. Since possessing a pencil was a crime punishable by death, her mind became her notebook. She utilized her extraordinary memory, honed by years of transcribing plays in the theater. She mentally recorded everything. She memorized the exact shade of the gray Polish sky. She memorized the brutal geometry of the barracks. Most importantly, she memorized the names, the stories, and the final words of her dying comrades. When a woman fell in the freezing mud, Charlotte was there, whispering to her, promising that her name would not be forgotten. She became a walking archive of the dead. She also fought to keep their minds alive. Huddled together in the dark, filthy barracks, starving and freezing, Charlotte would organize clandestine theater performances. She would recite Molière's The Misanthrope entirely from memory. For a few fleeting minutes, the women were not prisoners in a death camp. They were back in a warm, brightly lit theater in Paris. Charlotte used art as a shield against the absolute degradation of their humanity. The climax of her endurance wasn't a single battle, but 1,000 daily victories against despair. One day, a fellow prisoner did the unthinkable. She traded her entire daily ration of bread, the tiny, stale crust that was the only thing keeping her alive, for a smuggled, microscopic stub of a pencil and a torn scrap of paper. She gave it to Charlotte. The sacrifice was monumental. But the women knew that Charlotte's memory was their only hope of outliving the barbed wire. Charlotte hid the paper in the lining of her ragged uniform. It became a sacred relic. The physical toll was devastating. Charlotte contracted typhus. Her body wasted away to a skeletal frame. She hallucinated constantly, teetering on the very edge of the abyss. But the faces of the women, the voices she had promised to carry to, the outside world, kept pulling her back from the brink. She dragged herself out of the infirmary block, knowing the SS regularly selected the sick for the gas chambers. She forced herself to stand during the agonizing roll calls. She refused to die. In January 1944, after a year in Auschwitz, the surviving women of the convoy were transferred to the Ravensbrück concentration camp in Germany. Of the 230 women who had sung the Marseillaise at the gates, only 49 were still alive. Charlotte was among them. They remained in Ravensbrück until April 1945, when the crumbling Third Reich finally handed them over to the Swedish Red Cross just before the war ended. Charlotte Delbo returned to Paris in the summer of 1945. She was 31 years old. She was physically broken and carrying a grief so profound it could not be quantified. She had survived, but her beloved husband was dead. 181 of her sisters from the convoy were dead. She sat in her apartment, surrounded by the invisible ghosts of Auschwitz. And then she began to write. She poured the horrors, the names, the smells, and the agonizing cold onto paper. She wrote with a brutal, poetic honesty that defied standard historical documentation. She did not just record the dates and facts. She recorded the raw, sensory trauma of the Holocaust. She finished her magnum opus, a trilogy called Auschwitz and After. But then she did something remarkable. She locked the manuscript in a drawer. She decided not to publish it. She wanted to test the validity of her own memory. She wanted to ensure that her writing was not just an immediate emotional reaction to trauma, but a permanent, undeniable truth that would withstand the test of time. She waited 20 years. When Auschwitz and After was finally published in 1965, it shook the literary and historical world. It was a masterpiece of witness testimony. Charlotte introduced a groundbreaking concept to the understanding of trauma. Deep memory versus ordinary memory. Ordinary memory allowed her to live in Paris, to drink coffee, to work, to exist in the present, but deep memory was the permanent, unhealed wound. Deep memory meant that part of her was still standing in the freezing snow of Auschwitz, hearing the bark of the dogs and the cries of her dying friends. She spent the rest of her life honoring the 49 who survived and the 181 who did not. She tracked down the families of the dead. She walked into their homes and fulfilled her promise, telling them exactly how their daughters, wives, and mothers had died. She brought them the final words she had memorized in the mud. Charlotte Delbo died in Paris on March 1st, 1985. Her story forces us to understand that resistance takes many forms. Sometimes it is a submachine gun. Sometimes it is a bomb on a train track. And sometimes resistance is the radical, unbreakable act of remembering. The Nazis built an empire specifically designed to obliterate human identity and erase the truth. Charlotte Delbo dismantled that empire with nothing but the sheer force of her memory. She proved that even in the darkest, most mechanized factories of death, the human spirit can refuse to be erased. She carried 181 ghosts out of Auschwitz in her mind, and through her words, she ensured they would live forever. If Charlotte's incredible dedication to the truth moved you today, please leave a like on this video to help us share her own powerful legacy. Subscribe to the channel to uncover more essential histories of the women who fought back in the darkest times. Tell us in the comments what you think is the most powerful way to preserve history, and thank you for helping us bear witness.